At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. He'll be presenting on addiction. Kevin Minnick is a licensed mental health and clinical addiction counselor, behavioral health probation officer, and court treatment specialist for Hancock County Courts. He has 30 years as a substance use and addiction professional. He is a SMART Recovery Chair for regional coordinators and facilitators for US and Canada. He is a former board member of Neighborhoods Against Substance Abuse and Mental Health Partners. Kevin, thank you for being here with us tonight.
Amanda, thanks for having me. I'm very honored to show up and be able to do this for you and for the people that are listening right now. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share a screen with everybody so that you can see some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Let me pull up my PowerPoint real quick, and I'll get my screen shared first, I guess. We'll do that. And there we go. And there we are. So I wanted to bring some issues forward and maybe change the way that we can address substance use and particularly addiction by maybe thinking about it in a different manner. And so I'm going to bring some things up, start with a little bit of a background, and then what we'll do is we'll start the process of discussing kind of the things that really need to be talked about, that I feel are important, at least for substance use and addiction. And that's why I've titled this Hints, Lies, and Allegations, because there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. And so I'm hopeful that we can lay down a better foundation for where we go from here. Okay, hang on here. Having a little bit of difficulty trying to get everything off the ground. There we go. So people will ask a lot of times when they have an addicted loved one, they've had somebody in their lives out of that way. They just have a lot of questions. One of the first questions is, well, how can I help? And the short answer to that is there's not a lot you can do, which confuses and befuddles a lot of people. Some people will say, well, is this a mental health condition? Are they suffering from depression or anxiety, or are they, do they need some counseling? Other people may take it to the spiritual level. Is this a spiritual issue? But the number one question that I get from loved ones, family members, people that are associated with somebody who has an addiction is quite simply, why does my mother, father, son, daughter, coworker, spouse, even my dog, like to drink or smoke pot or use heroin or take pills? Why do they gamble? Why do they chase the mailman? And so the questions are about something that seems aberrant or not natural in the lifestyle that most of us as humans lead on this planet. And so a lot of times, after some careful consideration, clinical assessment, maybe an in-depth interview with someone who is suffering from addictive disorder, the answer that I'm going to give them is not one that people expect. And in fact, the basis, the foundation, the reason why you see people using alcohol and drugs in ugly fashions is because they like the way that they feel when they do their particular, behavior of choice, let's say. And when I tell a loved one that, a family member, a mom or a dad, they are almost incredulous that the answer could be that easy, because they believe that there's something more to this than there is. But at the base of it all, we have to understand that all of us, do things because we like the way that it makes us feel. And the question that really needs to be answered is, what's going on with these individuals that would lead them to using substances in a fashion that would become dangerous and sometimes even deadly for them? And so I'm hopeful that we can get to a place tonight, that will give us some answers to that. Now, for a long, long time, I mean, way before I came into this field, when the discussion about alcohol or drugs or addiction issues came around, there was a lot of focus on the drugs. And today there's still a lot of focus on the drugs. And a lot of people are believing that the drug is the major problem. If we look at this continuum of drug and alcohol use, I think we can start to piece together a patchwork of ideas that might actually lead us to the point where I hope to get us tonight. We are using this continuum of alcohol and drug use because traditionally it had been a progression, meaning that once you started, you had an endpoint, which would have been the dependency or addiction. But what we've come to learn over the last 30 years, and more so in the last 10, is that this is more of a continuum where you move back and forth on this line quite often. And sometimes you can go all the way to the dependency and then back up somewhere else. So this is going to be one of these things where I really want to focus on just a couple things on this slide, because I think that they're very important for us to look at. What I want you to do is we want to look at the changing landscape that we see up there for use, okay? Let's start at the experimental use category. Look at that, social opportunity and externally motivated. And so what we're saying at this stage of the game is that any alcohol or drug use, even at its infantile stage, is based on things that are externally motivating for us, such as peer pressure, to look cool, to fit in, to be curious about it. And at this stage of the game, it's kind of one of those things of, am I going to like this? Am I not going to like this? How's this going to go? As we continue to then use that substance and become more accustomed to it, we're still based on choice. We're making choices, but again, the external influence is there. And so you can see on this slide that, recreational use, using at parties, it can be a very casual use. It's not very frequent. You can stop if you want to, or refuse it if you want to. Hey, do you want to go out tonight? I'll smoke some pot. No, I don't really feel like it. You're not using by yourself. And there are self-imposed rules for your use, such as only on Friday nights, or only with certain people, or only on certain occasions. And so it doesn't pervade your life. It's just there. As we move though to the problem use category, you can see that at the top, it says they were no longer restricted to special occasions. And by now we've established a pattern of our use, okay? So at this stage of the game, being able to use becomes more important. And then you start to see some problems that will show up in some of the categories listed: relationships, school, you may have legal problems, job problems, some money problems, things like that. But notice here that it says you plan or creates an opportunity to use. In other words, using has become important enough that you will center a lot of your activities around the use. And then we have some loss of control, which is a kind of an important concept that I'm going to explain really quickly here. We have four or five points of the term of loss of control. And that's based around if you lose control of how often or the frequency of your use. Most people are going to use somewhere between 1 and 3 times a week on an average. But what will happen is on a consistent level, if you can no longer say, I'll only use or drink on the weekends, and it could go anywhere from 1 to 7 days, that's an issue. If you can't control when you're using, what time of the day, maybe I won't, a lot of people don't drink until they're after work, off work rather, later in the evening or only on special occasions. But if you find that you're drinking before you go to work or getting out in the morning and take a hit off some weed, then you've lost control of when you're using. Of course, the amount that you use, that's always under pressure. If you can't tell me how many you're going to have or anything like that, that's an issue. And then if you don't control where you're using, as I've said before, there are certain places that behaviors are acceptable, and then there are certain places where certain behaviors are unacceptable. If you can no longer guarantee that you won't try to use, say, before you come to court, which we see a lot of, that's an issue. And then finally, if you don't control the consequences of it. So when we talk about loss of control, we're talking about really unable to control what goes on around when you start using. And then finally, we reach the dependency stage. And the dependency stage is described as having the need. In other words, you need it now. You have to use. There may be physical symptoms if you don't use. It may be something that you cannot get through a day without. And what you'll tend to do is you'll drop some responsibilities so you'll have the opportunity to use. So you can kind of tell that what's happening here is that there are a lot of things that are going on to get to this point, this dependency point. But notice not much says anything about the actual drug here. You know, we're not talking about whether or not this is a drug that has a high or low dependency. We're just talking about how people get to where they're at. And I think that's kind of an important idea. So let's file that away in the back of our head and go to the next slide. Now, when people start to have problems from their alcohol and drugs, when they see people that they love that start to have problems from alcohol and drugs, their first response is to try to do what I term as normal problem-solving behaviors. Because what they see is a cause and effect taking place. Okay, my loved ones started to use drugs, and so because of that now they've lost their job, they're in legal problems, they don't have any money. Cause and effect. Most logical problem-solving behaviors are going to look at that and say we have to change what's causing the problems, i.e. the drugs, and if we take those away, then everything else will right itself, if you will. And so the focus on this is that the problems are still the substances, okay? And to a point, there's a lot of people that seek treatment on a yearly basis that believe that very same thing. It's a pervasive thought process in our society. If I stop using drugs, then things will change. Well, no, not really. So let's take a fresh perspective on this. Let's take a little bit of a better idea about what's really taking place. What do we need to do, okay? I'm going to talk specifically about addiction because that's the one that causes most of the heartache and most of the problems. And so this fresh perspective maybe will help those of you who have a loved one that's suffering from it, and maybe some of you that are suffering from it, to maybe change that perspective and to look at it from a different angle, to maybe take some steps to get it solved. So the American Psychiatric Association lists, or at least describes, an addiction as an intense focus on a certain substance or substances such as alcohol or drugs to the point that it takes over their life. They keep using alcohol or drugs even when they know it will cause problems. And I think to a point there is a lot of that is very true today. There is that part that they're using drugs and to the point where it will cause problems. But the focus in this perspective is still on the drugs. And what I'm trying to say is maybe that's not where we should have our focus to begin with. That's probably not all there is to this then. There has to be another part that we either don't talk about or we don't understand. When we talk about addiction, we also have to add in a couple more qualifiers, if you will. Is that we have to talk about dependence. And dependence is, as you can see here, from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that is a state in which an organism functions normally in the presence of a substance. When you have a true alcoholic on your hands, okay, they function rather well, despite having a high level of alcohol in their bodies. I've talked to many, many people who have told me that they believe that their parent was alcoholic. And I would ask them about them and they said, well, I never saw him drunk. Well, being drunk isn't the end result for an alcoholic. An alcoholic has to have alcohol in their body just so they can function. So this is where this one comes from. Notice that it says under dependence as well, manifests as a physical disturbance once the substance is removed. We know that as withdrawal. However, when you talk to other people about it, and Stanton Peele is a well-known researcher for it, says the measure of an addiction is the point to which an involvement impacts people's lives and yet they cannot curtail the involvement. And I really like that idea because this allows us to start to build that new angle of ideas about addiction if we're thinking about the involvement that somebody spends in a particular behavior, whether that behavior is using alcohol or using drugs. Now, there are 4 points that I'd like to point out that I think are really important about when we talk about addiction. And the first one is that addictive use does not always mean that somebody has withdrawals. A lot of times I'll talk to somebody and say, do you believe that you're addicted? And they'll say, no, because when I stop, I don't have any withdrawals. Well, that doesn't mean anything. There are certain drugs like marijuana or cocaine or amphetamine type drugs that if you stop using them, you have no withdrawals, so to speak. But you can be using them at a level that is truly addictive. You know, it's not unusual for a cocaine or a meth addict to be using at a level, you know, $5,000 a week in cocaine is not unusual. But when they stop, not much happens to them. Also, physical dependency doesn't mean that somebody is addicted. Now, a lot of times, somebody who might come to a hospital setting and they're going to get some surgery, they may get a morphine drip while they're in there. They may be there for an extended period of time, 7 to 10 days. And then once they leave the hospital and on the way home and after they get home, they start to feel a little weird. You know, their palms are a little sweaty. They've got a little bit of muscle ache. Their stomach is upset. They may feel feverish. They suddenly have to go to the bathroom a lot. And they're experiencing a mild level of withdrawals from the morphine being taken away from them. And this is not unusual to see in situations like this, but that doesn't make them addicted. A lot of times people will switch drugs, but their behavior remains pretty much the same. I am acquainted with a gentleman who has had treatment at least 6 times, 6 different times, and it's been for 6 different drugs each time. Pain pills, pot, cocaine, alcohol, the whole 9 yards. It always changes when he gets admitted, but the behavior remains the same. And then lastly, I believe all of us tonight could probably come up with a lot of addictions that don't involve a substance at all. And yet we see exactly the same kind of destruction and chaos that comes when somebody is involved with a substance. Stuff like gambling, internet porn, shopping, working out, going to church, eating. You pretty much name it. There are a lot of professionals call process addictions. They're basically behavioral type addictions. But there has to be something that motivates people to behave in that manner, even with those things that some of us would look at as being kind of, quote, normal behaviors. You know, we have to shop to get some new things. We have to eat. You know, we have contact with other people. You know, sometimes I'll bet you $1. You know, we'll gamble a little bit like that. How could all these turn that way? How could those become as destructive as alcohol and drugs? You know, that's kind of where we're coming from now. So when we talk about the issues that come along with addiction, there are going to be some particular issues that come along with using alcohol, illicit drugs, prescription drugs, nicotine, even caffeine. And a lot of that has to do with, do you actually develop a tolerance and some withdrawal with these drugs? Because that has to be a consideration when we look at treatment. Are you going to need some physical medical help to actually be safe from this? But when we're talking about some of these, like I just said, gambling, sex and pornography, exercise, food, work, church, money, maybe another person, how do we lump all these together in the same process to be able to do those kind of things? Okay. Well, there's one common thread that runs among any addiction, regardless of what you're talking about. Okay. And it's your brain. Now, some of you may be old enough and remember back in the day when there were a lot of commercials that you could see, PSAs, public service announcements, where you see somebody that would drop an egg into a hot frying pan and it would, you know, fry up, and they would say, "This is your brain on drugs." And that was kind of a cute and jarring way to get our attention to that. But when it comes down to it, actually, the brain is the common thread for all this kind of stuff. And so we need to probably talk a little bit about what kind of happens there. So the seeds of addiction are really sown when we start doing something that we enjoy. And if you can see my slide, and you can see, you know, when you do something positive and you get some dopamine released, your brain starts to take note of that. And these are some questions that it asks itself. What brought that on? Was it a substance, a behavior, a food, a place? And then it takes cues from the environment. When were you doing it? What was going on? Were you with a certain person? And so we tend to then associate a lot of that stuff, back and remember it pleasantly. And so what you see down here at the bottom, when you're exposed to those environmental cues, you'll begin to feel the same drive and seek out that same pleasure. The drive can be powerful, and it can create an urge that's hard to control, okay? So this happens for all of us. I mean, it's not just people with addictive disorder. This is all of us. You know, we go to an amusement park and we ride the rides and we enjoy the roller coasters. And so the same thing happens here. Dopamine is released. We take note of all the things going around, and we fondly remember that years later, how much fun that was to ride that roller coaster, or go on a trip or whatever. So this is kind of a common occurrence for a lot of us, okay? But what happens for people that have addictive disorder is that their brain gets rewired, if you will, differently than everybody else's. So let's take a look at this slide if y'all can see. A non-addicted brain, notice that the control part of the brain is the largest part of the brain. And so the saliency, which is the part of using the substance, then is still subjugated to the control, as is the drive to use the drug, okay, and the memory that goes along with that drug, okay? So for, say, Mark Willenbring, who is a doctor who has done a lot of research on people who drink alcohol, and his research indicates that about 71% of the United States population can use alcohol and have very little to no problems with it at all. They're not really risky drinkers. They don't do silly things when they drink. And so what we can say of that 71% is that their brains look exactly like this, okay? They've got more control over when they drink and what they do. And there are a lot of things in their lives that mean more to them than the alcohol. But when you look at a person that has addictive disorder, notice that the saliency, the drive, and the memory are much larger than the control. So what's happened here is now we have a circuit that is open all the time to the alcohol and drugs or the behavior. And so the ability to actually control when they use is really stripped away from them because their brain has started to create new neural pathways that allow this to take place. And so when somebody says, why can't you just put it down? Why can't you just quit? There you go. You got a brain that's telling you can't do this, that if you do, something bad will happen. And then there's a couple things that are on here that I haven't made a slide of, but I just want to say them anyway. There's a couple belief systems that get started as well. And this belief system says not only is this good for me, but that I need it. And so if you believe that something's good for you and you need it, then the control over it is going to be very much smaller than anything else, okay? So we're dealing now with brain changes. And to an effect, we could call that brain disease if we want to. So to tie all this together in its purest form, addiction has less to do with the substances of choice than how they interact with the world and what they do in relation to that substance. And in fact, we can back that up by looking at the targets for what treatment is, okay? When we treat addiction, there are three areas which is the primary focus. And if you ask anybody that's done this, they'll admit this, is thoughts and feelings that go around using, the behaviors that are associated with it, and the belief systems, the things that they believe as well about their substances. And the changes have to come in terms of giving people new ways to, new tools, if you will, to change their thoughts and new pathways to deal with their emotions. Most of the people that I've treated in the last 30 years have a real difficult time with certain emotions, and they just avoid others altogether. As well as a skill set to address their addictive behaviors. One of the mantras of treatment is you have to change the people, places, and things. Well, that's a behavior. That's a skill set that has to be done. And most persons with addictive disorder are going to hang out with other people that have addictive disorders. And so there's a whole shift in who you hang out with and what you do and things like that. And then the belief systems is to challenge long-held beliefs about the addiction or about the drug. And believe me, those things are very difficult to change at times. It takes a lot of internal focus to look at that and say, what do I really believe about this drug and why is it so important to me? When we talk about relapse, which is part of the process, unfortunately, that we have to deal with as treatment providers, what most people would believe is that, well, Tom got into recovery, but he's drinking again and he's relapsed. And they equate the relapse with the actual action of using a substance. But at the heart of it, relapse is not really about the drinking and drugging. Drinking and drugging is actually the very last step, according to Karen Skorsky. It's the last step in the relapse process. But when they return to previous ways of thinking, behaving, and believing, and using old automatic survival skills to deal with life, that's the relapse. In fact, when Gorski initially set this out, he had 37 steps of a relapse. He narrowed it down to 10. But the first 9 were showing the behavioral return to old ways of dealing with life, what we term as the old addictive ways of living, with the last one being that they actually picked up and used. And so there are a lot of researchers and people out there who have taken a look at relapse, and we know now that relapse has very little to do with alcohol and drugs. So now what I've said in the last 20 minutes or so is that addiction and recovery are less about, and addiction and relapse are less about the drugs than they are about the behaviors. So one of our great researchers in this, Alan Malat, says that relapse refers to a breakdown or failure in a person's attempt to maintain change in any set of behaviors. So you can see how that works. If we're trying to lose weight, if we're trying to quit smoking, if we're trying not to watch as much TV, if we're trying maybe not to eat at night when we get home from work, which is a real problem, we make that commitment to change that behavior. We relapse when we go back and start the behavior again because we were trying to make the change. Okay, so again, this goes back to behavior, beliefs, thought processes. So where does that leave us? What can we do? Well, by changing the way that an addicted person thinks and behaves and believes, what we do is we set them on a right path of trying to get to some place where they can get that done. I wanted to get this slide up here because I want people to know that there are different levels of treatment that will help people get those things going in the right direction. And all of these levels are based on the involvement with the drug. Most places, if your involvement has created enough problems for you, are going to start you at the level 2 intensive outpatient treatment because we believe that that's the best place to start. There are going to be a few people that can use what we term as an intervention service or possibly outpatient services because maybe they're in the process of changing that behavior, but they need a little bit more support. From level 2 on up, it just gets more intense and more focused on what kind of things you have to do, all the way up to level 4, which is medically managed inpatient services, more along the lines of a 7 to 10 day detox, if you will. Okay, so once we get people into treatment, then the process of changing those thoughts and behaviors and belief systems starts to change. One of the other things, though, that needs to go along with treatment is support groups. And I put a list up here of just 7 different types of support groups that you can find about anywhere. Of course, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Narcotics Anonymous are 2 of the most well-known and widely used. They've been around the longest. But then there are other ones: Rational Recovery, Smart Recovery, Life Service, Life Ring, what we call that, Moderation Management, Women for Sobriety, and Secular Organizations for Sobriety are just some that are on this list. And as you look at this, you can see that each one of them has their own strengths. Each one of them has emphasis on social support, their optimal length of the program, their principles, and whether or not they have support for family and friends, which, you know what, that's an important part. If you have a loved one, you need some help too, because believe it or not, that addiction has affected your belief systems too. And so what I wanted to do with this slide was not to go into all these, but to say there are many, many support groups. Research indicates that people who actually go to treatment and then attend recovery support groups are almost 90% more likely to achieve the 6-month mark of sobriety than people who either drop out of treatment or don't go to recovery support groups while they are in treatment. If they do neither, they have less than about a 38% chance, I should say, to gain 6 months. So it's really difficult for an individual to do that all on their own. Einstein famously said, you can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it. And so using that as our springboard, we want people to at least go to treatment and get some support. And if they don't feel like going to treatment, at least get to a recovery support group. I want to talk about SMART because we believe that people should be empowered to make their own choices about their recovery. And research indicates that the more opportunity that a person has to make choices in their recovery, the more likely it is that they'll follow through. We use evidence-based practices, which means that it's scientifically based. We are an abstinence-oriented recovery group. And you can see on here that we use what we term as our 4-point program, where we deal with 4 points that we feel are very important for recovery. Excuse me. Building and maintaining motivation to stay clean and sober, coping with urges and cravings, managing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There's our key word again. And then living a balanced life. And believe it or not, that balanced life, that last point on there, is so important that I don't think that we as treatment providers have spent enough time talking about that. We spend a lot of time talking about the drugs and about what we need to do to change all that. But having a balanced life is actually an antithesis to an addicted life. When you have balance in, your financial stuff, your morals, your health, your work, your social, your developmental stuff, recreation and family time, when you have that going, that is an antidote for addiction. And so we try to help people work through those 4 points that I had and to reach this point right here. We feel like once they reach this, they've pretty much come the gamut. So in sum, addiction treatment is more about changing thoughts, feelings, behaviors, belief systems than it is anything else. So recovery support groups are focused on that. Treatment should be focused on that. And once we can get somebody in to do that kind of stuff, then we can help them move on down the line toward a better life. This is my contact information for anybody who would want to have any questions about Smart Recovery, or if you just have any questions about treatment in general. I am a professional, so I can answer just about anything that you would ask. I've worked in all phases of recovery, all the way from inpatient to the most non-restrictive outpatient that there is. So you can call me at either the number or reach me at the Smart Recovery thing. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Amanda, Hancock Regional Hospital, as well as Healthy 365 for allowing me to come here. I put some numbers on the board in case any of y'all have some other questions. You can reach the Healthy 365 group at their number there. We also have the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, where you can give somebody a call in case they've got something like that going on. And then Community Health Network offers a text service by which you can reach a crisis worker by making a text to 741-747. And with that, I will close and again say thank you to all who appeared tonight. If you need anything, please give me a call. But I don't mean to sound weird, but I hope I don't hear from you. I hope that you were able to get enough out of this and get yourself going in the right direction. But if you do, please give me a call. I'll be more than happy to answer your calls. And Amanda, again, thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate it.